Okay, great. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this evening's meeting. I'm Heather Anderson with the Office of City Planning. I'm also part of the Cannabis Business Preparation Committee, of which there are several other members in attendance this evening. We have Kevin Kelly, Manager of City Planning, Linda Kingsley, Corporation Counsel. Linda, Kevin, and I will be presenting to you shortly. We also have Tammy Mayberry, Chief of Staff for Mayor Evans, as well as John Brock, also with the Mayor's Office. And a little bit later, we'll be joined by Jennifer Burns, who is part of the Central Library Business Insight Center, who provide a lot of support for potential cannabis business owners. Also here this evening is Jim, our ASL interpreter. So we do have interpretation available. In about 20 minutes in, we're going to check to see if there's anyone in attendance who needs interpretation. If not, we'd like to be able to give Jim the evening off unless his services are needed. Great. So we are here tonight to have an in-depth conversation with you about potential zoning and local regulation for cannabis businesses, essentially the where and the how of cannabis businesses. Note that I said local regulations because, as we all know, the state is still developing regulations or draft regulations for their state process for licensing. Tonight, we're here to talk about the potential for city regulations for cannabis businesses. The city opted into the full cannabis industry in order to maximize economic opportunities for the industry in Rochester and to join the state's efforts to address the harm caused by the war on drugs. We had our first community meeting on April 14th, and we had some really great questions and discussion there. If you were unable to attend, please feel free to visit the city's cannabis webpage to watch the video. We've placed the link for the page in the chat box. We're looking forward to another set of great questions and comments this evening. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Linda.
Thank you. Okay, we're mostly here tonight to hear your questions and concerns and comments. But what we'll be doing first is making a brief presentation about the basic information we'd like to make sure you're aware of. And then we'll be utilizing the majority of the time for those questions and comments. Just a little bit of background, as a lot of you probably know, the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, which you may hear people refer to as MRTA, was adopted by the state of New York in 2021. Effective at that time, the possession of marijuana became legal in New York State, which is why shortly after that, you were able to see people openly possessing and using marijuana. However, there were also significant pieces of it that will require regulation and licensing from the state. What the law did in 2021 was allow locals very limited regulation. You know, if you opted in, which meant you were going to have businesses in your community, dispensaries and consumption lounges, the only regulations that the city of Rochester has a right to make regarding marijuana are what are referred to as time, place, and manner regulation of, again, dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. It's basically, as is noted, is the where and the how. Time is just what it sounds like. Unless the state sets up its own regulations for opening and closing hours, then we will be able to, as a city, determine what hours both retail and consumption facilities can be open. Place is a matter of zoning. Where in the city can that be? All activities in the city are controlled by zoning. Residential areas, business, commercial areas, industrial areas, and just like all other businesses, zoning will apply to these businesses. And manner are various regulations that would affect how the businesses are run. And those are some of the things we want to hear from you. What are some of the things you feel are appropriate for us to be considering in manner? The majority of the controls in New York State are handled by the State Office of Cannabis Management and the State Cannabis Control Board, which are both under the jurisdiction of the State Liquor Authority. They're a subset under there. Among the licenses that they will be giving out are cultivator, processor, distributor, dispensary, which is the retail establishment, on-site consumption lounges, which will be the marijuana equivalent of a bar, delivery, nursery, micro business, which allows you to be involved in everything from the beginning of the growing to the sale, and a cooperative, which would handle anything but dispensing. It's expected that the state will issue the first round of adult use dispensary licenses either at the very end of this year or the very beginning of next year, which is why it's important for us to make some decisions in the next few months as to what the zoning will be and what the other time, place, and manner regulations would be, because they need to be in place before licenses are issued. The mayor actually, after he was elected, even before his first day in office, established the Cannabis Business Preparation Committee. He appointed a number of us to serve on that committee, and we've been working on this process since then. As I said before, it is our goal to have the regulations in place by Labor Day or in that area. We are having a series of meetings. This is our third dealing with zoning and regulations. The other two dates, some of you were probably at those events, and this is the third one. There will also be several business development meetings to focus on that aspect. A cannabis support open house on July 13th from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and a cannabis workforce development event on August 10th from 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., both of them at the Central Library in the auditorium. Kevin?
Thank you, Linda. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of the background and what brought us here today. And what we're going to be talking about tonight is primarily the zoning side of things and other local regulations that we might be able to address. But so I want to walk through that a little bit, and then we can get into the Q&A. Before I do that, just want a couple of housekeeping things. If you didn't hear or haven't noticed, we of course have an ASL interpreter this evening. And now that we're into the meeting a bit, we wanted to check to see if in fact anyone here is in need of those services. So if you are, please just type yes in the chat. And if no one is, then we can release Jim here in a couple minutes to head out of the meeting. But I want to make sure if anyone here needs it, that they let us know. And then also just after we do the presentation, we're going to just field your questions and comments. I will have to step out at that point. My daughter's in a play tonight in the school play, so I do need to step out to go to that. But between John and Linda and Heather and Tammy, you're in good hands tonight. Okay, so Jim, if you want to just give that another minute or two, if anyone else, if anyone does need interpreting services, please type yes in the chat. If not, thank you, Jim, for joining us. So as Linda said, the mayor has sort of convened this committee called the Cannabis Business Preparation Committee, made up of mostly city staff, but we have a couple of community members as well that are serving as co-chairs to this. And we're just kind of part way into the process. We have not developed any final recommendations by any stretch. We have some ideas that we're thinking about. We have some ways that we're sort of leaning. but this is the point in the process where we want to check in with the community and see what you think of those suggested approaches to this. And that's why we've had a couple of meetings so far about this, and welcome feedback through these meetings and through our website. So what we want to talk about tonight is just sort of a conceptual approach to how we might regulate cannabis-based businesses at the local level, recognizing that New York State is probably going to drive most of those regulations.
Kevin, I don't see anybody. So I guess I'm going to go. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jim. Appreciate it. Okay, so let's start with the where side of the equation. Where might these businesses be allowed to locate? And there are essentially two layers to this question. The first layer comes from the state, and the state has already decided that there will be distancing requirements from two what they call sensitive uses, schools and houses of worship, so that a cannabis-based business could not be within 500 feet of a school or within 200 feet of houses of worship. And what you see on the map there kind of illustrates that. And the second layer, before we go to the next slide, the second layer is what we're able to do locally. And that is deciding which zoning districts, those types of uses would be allowed, recognizing that even if it's allowed in a district, if it's within one of those buffers shown on the screen there, that would sort of cancel that out. So let's zoom in a little bit on the map, and I can show you a little bit more what I'm talking about. So you have there the existing zoning districts that are in place right now. We have residential districts, our R1, 2, and 3. We have commercial districts, C1, 2, and 3. Our downtown area is known as Center City District, that sort of thing. So you can see those in the legend. And then the sort of grayed out areas reflect those buffers from schools and houses of worship. Now, I would just point out that those are not precise boundaries. They're just kind of generalized. So if you see a bubble around an area, that means there's probably a school there or a church or a mosque or something like that. But if an applicant came forward that wanted to open up a particular business, we would have to do more precise measurements. This is just a quick snapshot of how much of the city would be sort of canceled out, if you will, by those sensitive uses. So there definitely are areas of the city that those businesses would not be permitted, but there definitely would be areas where they would. So we have to kind of look at those two layers together, the state's sensitive use buffers and our local zoning districts. Next slide, please. So in making those decisions, it starts with doing a bit of research. And our committee has been doing quite a bit of research with other cities and other states that already allow cannabis-based businesses, not just looking online, but actually directly speaking with sort of our counterparts in those other cities, other city planners, law departments from other cities, that sort of thing. And talking to them about how things are going with, they might have been doing this for a couple of years and trying to get some lessons learned from that. So we've been learning from that. And as it relates to zoning, a common approach that we're seeing here is that cannabis-based businesses are not allowed at all in residential zones, with some limited exceptions, such as in a high density area. And that commercial areas would be where those businesses would be allowed. And then in some instances, maybe some industrial districts would allow under certain circumstances. So that's a common approach that we're seeing. We are considering that approach here in Rochester. If we go to the next slide, I can show you a little bit more about what that means. Keeping in mind is really important. What we're mostly talking about tonight are two of those business types. One is a dispensary, which is like a retail outlet where people sell marijuana-based products, not necessarily to be consumed there, but they're just selling them there. And then the other business is on-site consumption, which is more of a place where you would go to consume. So the way we're kind of leaning, or at least the way that we'd like to get your feedback about tonight, is if we were to treat those dispensaries the same way that we treat retail sales and services, that would mean that they would be prohibited in R1, 2, and 3, except on the ground floor of a mixed-use building that's a larger scale building, like has 20 or more units. Otherwise, those businesses would not be allowed anywhere in residential districts. Again, that's a common approach that we're seeing in other cities. And if we were to treat it like a retail sales and service business, that it would be permitted in the commercial districts in downtown. And then in the case of industrial circumstances, they would be permitted. So that's an approach to the dispensary type of business. And then on the next slide, it's almost identical. This is the same approach, excuse me, to on-site consumption businesses, in that we would treat them the same way that we currently treat bars and restaurants, which are, again, not allowed in residential zones, and certainly not in R1 and 2, but in certain circumstances in R3 that might be allowed. And that bars and restaurants are permitted in commercial areas, obviously, and in certain circumstances in industrial districts. So if we were to treat on-site consumption lounges the same way, they would look a lot like bars and restaurants. Keeping in mind, again, there's that additional layer of the state's sensitive uses, which we don't have any control over. So that's kind of our conceptual approach to where we might allow these types of businesses. And during the Q&A, we look forward to hearing your thoughts on, do you think that's the right approach? Would you tweak it? That sort of thing. So another possibility that the state is allowing us to consider is adding additional sensitive uses to the list, in addition to schools and houses of worship. For example, that these types of businesses couldn't be within, say, 500 feet of an R center, or maybe there's another use. To this point, we have heard mostly feedback that that's not necessarily a good idea to add an additional sensitive use to that list, but no decisions have been made. So we welcome your feedback on that tonight. If we added an additional sensitive use, it would sort of cancel out a little bit more of the city. Okay. So that is what we're thinking about in terms of where these uses might be permitted. And I will turn it back over to Heather now to talk about how these things might be regulated.
Thanks, Kevin. So yeah, these are some ideas for how adult use cannabis dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges should operate. So here are some general requirements that we as committee members think are reasonable and have seen and are seeing in other cities. First, a business permit. So currently, Rochester requires specific businesses such as bars and smoking establishments to acquire a business permit in order to operate. And it's really a tool to ensure that businesses are complying with local regulations related to business operations. To apply for a business permit, it costs $25. And then relevant departments review the application and either approve or deny the application within 30 days. Once approved, a permit lasts for 1 year, at the end of which business owners must renew. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to go ahead and I'll put the link to the web page for the city's webpage for business permits, as well as the city code section related to business permits, so that you can explore those things further if you'd like. We've also been discussing requiring an outdoor lighting plan, and that's really aligned with the city's priorities for pedestrian safety, as well as general safety and success of commercial areas. And for on-site consumption lounges, we've been discussing the potential for requiring a ventilation plan to really prevent or mitigate smoke exposure. We are researching state law related to smoking, generally smoking, to understand if that would be redundant. And here are operating and performance standards that we have been discussing, that we're exploring, and that we also, again, see in other cities. One is requiring licenses to be visibly posted. That's a pretty straightforward requirement and definitely aligned with what cities generally expect of similar businesses. Odors shall not be detectable from the outside of the building. Being able to smell cannabis is definitely a common concern for residents. It's really important to keep in mind that cannabis is legal in the state. So someone could walk down the street smoking cannabis right now legally. In other words, the city can't prevent the smell of cannabis in the air generally, but it's not unusual. It's actually common for cities to require businesses to mitigate any business-related odors. Businesses must be in a fully enclosed building. This is a requirement that we're in early discussion on. It's related to similar concerns about odors, but maybe more importantly or more predominantly security concerns. We're also interested in limiting the hours of operation for dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. We haven't developed any specific ideas around that, so we're interested in hearing from you all on that this evening. And for on-site consumption lounges, we've been exploring requiring staff at the entrance to check IDs and make sure that no one underage is being served. So 2 more topics that we've been in conversation with. One is security, or a discussion or exploring about, sorry. One is security. As you all, I'm sure know, cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, which means that most banks do not work with cannabis businesses, and consequently, most cannabis businesses are cash-only businesses, which can present security concerns. So we've been discussing the potential for requiring a security measure or measures of dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. This is something, again, we haven't developed specific ideas around, so we'd like to discuss with you tonight. And lastly, a good neighbor agreement. So the city, of the businesses that are required to have a business permit, the city also asks business owners to complete what's called a good neighbor agreement. There's no additional fee required for a good neighbor agreement. Really, good neighbor agreement is a tool to ensure that business owners understand specific regulations, such as those around waste disposal, noise, and signage, as well as it's meant to encourage business owners to be a good neighbor with doing things like preventing loitering outside the business, keeping the property clean, and maintaining a good line of visibility into the business. So it's essentially a 2-page document that owners self-certify they understand these regulations and expectations of businesses. So that concludes our presentation on the ideas for the where and the how for cannabis businesses. We're now going to enter question and comments. I think that we have a small enough group that we can go ahead and allow for people to raise their hands in order to either ask questions or provide us feedback on any of these ideas. I'm going to stop sharing now so we can all see each other. So please keep in mind that, again, this meeting is about zoning and regulations. We have meetings later scheduled that are going to be about business development. We want to make sure everyone has a chance to speak. So if you raise your hand more than once, we may have to, if it's your second or third or fourth question or comment, we may want to circle around to folks that haven't spoken yet before we get back to your second, third, or fourth comment. And lastly, I just want to make sure you all know that we are recording your comments and questions to track them as part of this process, and we're excited to have this discussion with you tonight. So,
Heather, sorry, before we jump in, just a technical question, because we did spotlight the speakers, are you able to see on your end the other participants, so we're able to see folks raising their hands, or do we need to remove those spotlights?
I think that's a good, thank you for pointing that out. I'm going to go ahead and remove the spotlight so we can all see each other.
And some folks are raising their hands, but others are welcome to certainly put a question in the chat if you prefer to do that, and we can monitor that. So yeah, I think if we all switched our view to gallery now, we'd be able to go Brady Bunch style with participants here.
Okay, great. So we do have 2 people with raised hands. Morgan was the first. Morgan, so feel free to unmute and ask a question or give us a comment.
Hi, thank you, first of all, for having these sessions. I really appreciate it. I am owner of a cannabis management company. So we actually manage licensees, hopefully in New York State, if any of them get issued. And then we do manage cannabis cultivation operation in Massachusetts as well. One of the things that has helped us actually in our Massachusetts operations has been what's called a host community agreement. The host community agreement is a requirement of licensure there, where you essentially agree with the town, hey, we're going to be good to you. You're going to be good to us. Everybody's cool with us being here. And it has really helped to facilitate the conversation with the town officials, as well as with the town people themselves who show up to the community outreach meetings and such. We've actually gotten to know a lot of the local residents that live nearby where our facility is going to be built. It's been an absolutely fantastic tool. So if I could give you a piece of feedback on some of your stuff here, it's that I like the idea of the good neighbor thing. I know that that's an existing policy for the city of Rochester. I think that having some additional process or some additional addendum for cannabis related businesses would actually be helpful. You won't hear that from many cannabis business owners. I think the more regulation, the harder it is to operate. But in this particular case, having a really positive relationship with the city and with the residents that have to exist in the same space with these businesses can be really beneficial to the business owner and to the community. So that's my feedback. Again, I appreciate your time. And of course, if you'd like to contact me directly, please feel free to. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgan. That's helpful. Okay, next we have Logan.
Hello. Hi. Can you hear me? Is everything good?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, awesome. Thank you for having me, and thank you for these I guess what symposiums and so on and so forth. Information gathering is a wonderful thing for any process, is it not? Been following this for I think over a year now, since Mayor Lovely Warren was doing it, and she's not doing it anymore, obviously. But I wanted to double tap on two different things. Well, I guess they kind of go hand in hand. The security issue, right? So, especially in this day and age, it seems like security is a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful thing. I know that firsthand, being a veteran of the United States Army. I also know that at some time, or I guess now, I guess I can consider myself an avid pot user. More times than not, I've found that de-escalating a situation, or there being a situation in any way, shape, or form when cannabis is involved, is hearsay, right? You know, this hardly ever happens. The only time is when there's like gobs and gobs of money involved. The times that cannabis, operating hours and stuff like that, I think that should be loosely left to they say like a dispensaries or whatnot, or a lounge. Constraining them. Bars can be awake, or bars can be open until 2 o'clock in the morning, right? I don't understand why would we constrain something that where we see no aggressive tensions and stuff like that from. Like if you would say dispensaries can't be open past 11 p.m. It's like, well, why? You leave a bar open, people can get drunk, riot and rage until 2 o'clock in the morning, but something that literally does the exact opposite. Take that away from the Commonwealth or common folk, and then raise the point of security and stuff like that. If there's a lounge that wants to be open until 4 o'clock in the morning, because sometimes you have early birds, sometimes you have late birds, and they want to burn up, then fine. I think that should be loosely left to the discretion of the small business owners. I think that giving them the power to be able to make those decisions for themselves, not only it's a peace of mind, but it also builds the relationship between like the city, the state, the legislation, and the business owners themselves, right? And on the security side, there's other, like instead of big name corporations, so there's other small guys out there that are willing to do the work, right? So, if you're willing to be awake until 4 o'clock in the morning to make sure no potheads do anything crazy, well, then why not? That's just my feedback. I don't know.
Thank you, Logan. We appreciate it. I think on the security side, I can say it's one of the conversation has kind of been, it's a balance, right? Of not wanting to present barriers to people being business owners, but also wanting to ensure that the business owners are safe. So it's the ongoing conversation Okay, we have a question in the chat box that says, what about cultivation / hydroponic cannabis business where zoned / location? What about? The person who entered that, I think their name is, are they here still? Charles, are you here still? I wanted to get you to clarify that question. And I don't know that they're still here.
It's a common question, so we could tackle it even if he's not here, he or she is not here.
Well, yeah, I'm a little bit unclear on if what the question is, but if it's just about where it will be allowed by zoning, we haven't, that hasn't been finalized yet, but in the presentation, we talked about how we are leaning towards what we see in a lot of other cities, which is really allowing dispensaries where we allow retail sales and services, which is in commercial zones generally, and in limited circumstances in high density residential and industrial, but primarily in commercial zones, as well as on-site consumption lounges where we allow bars and restaurants, which are the same zones. So allowed in commercial and only in limited circumstances in R3 and an industrial zone.
And if it's one of the other uses like cultivation or hydroponic kind of thing, that's more on the sort of production side of things. And Linda, maybe you can clarify this a little bit, but we're still kind of waiting for the state to be a little bit more definitive in terms of how much the city can weigh in on that side of things. We're mostly focused on the dispensary and consumption lounge side of things. The cultivation and hydroponics a little bit different. You're on mute, Linda.
Sorry, the time, place, and manner is basically for the dispensaries and the consumption lounges. But I suspect, given that, you know, even no property gets to be just anywhere it wants in the city. I mean, zoning is a basic concept of local government. So I suspect that the ultimate result is that we will be permitted to reasonably determine zones for cultivation and other related, and whether we put them in industrial, you know, again, we'll have to look at what a like business is and where the businesses are now that exist already for medical marijuana, and go from there.
Sorry, I answer the question thinking about dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. I got that one-track mind right now.
Yeah.
Okay, I believe Glennis was next. Glennis, feel free to unmute and ask your question or make your comment.
Hi, thank you. Glennis Valenti with Southwich Planning Committee, and our farmers market received an email from a group called Potted Gold, and they represent farmers in New York State and maybe other places too. But this was about selling plants at the farmers markets, and apparently they've done this, or they're planning to do it. They said they've participated in flower days. I'm not sure if that was here in Rochester. So is that something that the city is going to regulate also? You know, we don't have a problem with it, but you know, I'm here at these meetings just trying to find out what's legal and what isn't right now. It says I wrote a couple notes from the email, plants and clone sales from hemp farmers who have or conditional licenses from New York State. This doesn't involve products or anything like that. It's really just plants and clones.
So I think a couple of us probably have some things to say. I think we still have some clarification from the state generally to get. My feeling of what you're talking about is similar to nursery sales, which is something that someone would have to be licensed by the state for. There's a nursery license, which involves people being able to sell like starts, right? So that people can do home growing. So I think that that's something people would need to be licensed for, and the state has not started licensing nurseries yet. Linda or Jen, I want to mention Jennifer Burns has joined us from the Business Insight Center, and I think Linda and Jen may both have something to add to that.
I would agree that while it may well be happening at farmers markets, because there are a lot of things happening that don't quite comply with the law, and the question is enforcement of it and what is dedicated to that. But selling any products of marijuana are going to have to be under a state license.
Yeah, I mean, we wouldn't have them there if they didn't have licensing and things like that. But I just wanted to know if the city, if the city regulations or anything supersede that. The other
No, we
thing that,
can't supersede the
oh,
state
the
laws. And in
state,
fact,
okay,
it'll be interesting because I don't know if the state will ultimately, most licenses are connected with a bricks and mortar location. And it'll be interesting as the regs develop, will the state allow for any accommodation for sales at farmers markets or, edibles at fairs, that kind of thing.
I'll,
Well, also, if I can just say, out of the licenses that have been granted thus far for growers, none of them have been to a company called Potted Gold.
right, okay. Yeah, they're just like a kind of an umbrella company, I think. They mentioned here, I'm looking at my email here, Clear Safe Greenhouses, AK Integrity Farms and Greenhouses, Ophart Farms.
I have a list of all of the people that have been given conditional licenses for
Okay.
cultivation, and I can send that to you.
Okay.
And it delineates which county, the company is based in.
Right. Okay.
But they are not ringing a bell, but I could definitely be wrong, but I can, if you put your email into the chat, I can send that list to you.
Okay, and I can just send you the email that I got from them, or that we got from them. Also, again, we haven't
Absolutely.
received any applications or anything for cannabis products or CBD or anything like that at the market, but I just wanted to check in case that comes up at some point during the season, since you were talking about Labor Day being, kind of a deadline, or the beginning of some of these regulations possibly. So
But those,
Okay.
just so you understand, those regulations are what we're putting in place to apply to businesses once they have state licenses.
Right.
And so we don't decide the state licenses. The state licenses for most areas, like dispensaries, will not come until the very end or the beginning of next year.
Right. I have another odd question. I'm sorry to take up time here. Our farmers market currently is across the school, or across the street from a school and a church. Would sales like of plants or anything have anything to, would we have to be concerned with that? Would that bar any sales?
So the sensitive uses that the state is imposing are for dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges only at this point.
Only, okay.
So
Okay.
unless we are still waiting for more state regulations on the cannabis businesses generally. So that could change, but as of yet, they would not be impacted. And I do
Okay.
want to mention too that the state already prior to MRTA was licensing hemp licenses, right? It was issuing hemp licenses. So there are folks that are licensed by the state to sell CBD, but that's licensing that's already been in place for a while. This is part of
Right.
the new. So you might.
And that doesn't automatically extend to marijuana, just because marijuana is legal
Right.
now.
Right.
A separate license.
Understood. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time.
No problem. Thank you, Glennis. Okay, we have a few
Mhm.
questions in the chat, and then we have two people with hands raised in that order. So let's go through the chat. There's a question. Will there be a session regarding the types of licenses that were outlined in the MRTA? There's a lot of legal language that can be confusing for most individuals. And so any of my colleagues can feel welcome to chime in here, but I will say that we're still waiting for a lot of direction from state on things. So we're really presenting on what we have purview over and what we understand about local regulations or the potential for local regulations. I highly suggest looking at the website for the Office of Cannabis Management, signing up for email updates, and if you can, attending Cannabis Control Board meetings where they're looking at draft regulations as they come out, as they're drafting them. To really get kind of clued in and stay informed and involved in the state conversation, because I think that that's going to be, we're not really in charge of the definitions of those license types. So that's going to be your best bet, I think. Anyone else?
Yeah, I would also, sorry, reach out to the Business Insight Center. We have attorneys on retainer that interpret the language of the MRTA. For lay people like myself. So if you have a specific question about the verbiage, please reach out to us and we can get you clarification on that.
That's great. Thank you, Jen. And the link for the Business Insight Center cannabis support page is at the top of the chat if you guys are interested in connecting there. Okay, the next question in the chat, why are there stores open now in Rochester selling product? Well, they are illegally selling product. There are locations that are illegally selling product right now. I don't know how much more you would like us to go into that, William. Are you still with us? Do you have any specific questions related to that? Anyone who says that they're licensed to dispense cannabis right now, adult use cannabis, is not being truthful.
One of the things we have done is if we get, I mean, obviously the police in Rochester have greater challenges than a small marijuana sale. But we will, when we get complaints about places, we will report them to the Office of Cannabis Management, who will do two things. One is they'll issue a cease and desist letter. The other is if a business chooses to ignore that and then at some point tries to become a legal business, they will have a great deal of trouble doing that after they have ignored the rules and have just been operating on their own. There have been a few marijuana businesses that have been so large, so blatant, creating other community problems with a lot of neighborhood complaints where we have taken nuisance action to get those properties closed.
Okay, so the next question, two quick questions. What will be consumption lounge age limit and will there be a need to show ID? Linda, do you want to take that?
21 will be the age to come into a consumption lounge, and whether they will be showing ID, whether the state will require it, and if so, whether we'll require it. It is my recollection, Jennifer, correct me if I'm wrong, and you remember that it's not in the statute, but it may well end up being in the state regulations. Even if it isn't, my suspicion is that most dispensaries and most lounges will ask for ID at the door because those licenses are very expensive to obtain and people do not want to risk losing them.
Yeah, there's definitely they'll be asking for ID. There is some discussion around who can work in like the back rooms and whether or not they can be 18.
Mm-hmm.
So that's yet to be determined, but so there may be, you know, like we typically think of a bar, you have to be 21 to work in a bar. but you could be 18 to work in a back room of a cannabis dispensary. So is still just, again, wait and see, which nobody likes to hear. So.
Okay, great. The next question from Matthew is, are we able to apply for a license or permit for a dispensary? How are local dispensaries able to operate? So again, the State Office of Cannabis Management is the state agency which reviews applications for dispensaries. The Cannabis Control Board is the decision-making body. They are opening up the first round of dispensary applications this summer, which is for a limited number of people. Rather, it's for equity applicants that meet specific criteria. So currently people there's not general application for dispensaries right now. And again, the state is the licensing authority. So we're not really in control of that. So highly recommend looking at OCM's website and following the board meetings to understand all those things. Anyone want to chime in on that? Okay. All right. So the next question, I believe Reagan was the next person. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi, it's Lisa Reagan. I'm a resident, and I'm also in the South Wedge. I come at considering this from having been a former public defender and an attorney in federal court who dealt with the cases of largely people of color who I think shouldn't have been in prison in the first place, but were often serving lengthy sentences. So I'm very happy that pot has been decriminalized and that the sale is going to be, regulated so that it, hopefully will change some of those biased enforcement things. My concern, though, in terms of how you start off regulating it is that, like the bail reform, which was essential, attitudes can be soured quickly when something's rolled out poorly and cause a backlash. And so I agree with Morgan's comments about regulation being helpful for setting the tone. And I would recommend that you be conservative in your approach to the extent that you're allowed to regulate certain things. And then based on experience, liberalize it, partly because of the lack of resources for general code enforcement in the city, and magnifying it with something that could potentially drive residents or businesses out if it's badly done is not helpful to any of us. In the South Wedge, we have an area where it is a very small residential area, largely surrounded by what's going to be mixed development on the arterials, right? So you have businesses, restaurants, bars right next to residential homes. And, as you know, the difference between alcohol and pot is that pot carries by air, right? And you can be intoxicated involuntarily without intending that or without wanting it. When I was representing residents in low-income residents in housing matters in the city, I often went into the apartments, and my senior clients and clients with disabilities were being medicated with pot. And they did not want to be. They were on other meds that it was not safe for them to have additional dosages. That was true for the kids as well. I'm not against the program. My son lives in San Francisco, and he talks to me about what happens there. He's also got small kids. And so he talks about what happens in a restaurant when you're in a restaurant and, the building shares space with another place, and you have to get up and leave because your kids are getting dosed. Right. And as we know, the landlords are who's in control of the ventilation system. There are plenty of situations where you've got, one use in the building that's interfering with another use because of the ventilation. And so one of the things I saw, particularly in the high rises that were subsidized in the city, and that's where smoking and any kind of drug use is prohibited, and somebody could lose their housing. The ventilation systems were unitary. And so what was happening in one apartment happened in all of the apartments. If it was happening in one apartment, it was in the elevator. If it was in the elevator, it was everywhere. And so to say that high density residential uses or, places might be the exception, I think risks putting families who already have very limited places to live in the city at higher risk. And I'm not suggesting that you can't do anything about the federal regulations that require in subsidized housing that there not be smoking, for example, but creating another layer of regulation that says, well, we think high density residential in this high rise or this 4-story residential unit is fine. And in this one, the feds are saying it's not fine for really good health reasons, which they almost never enforce, right? They enforce them the same way the criminal laws are enforced, in a biased manner. So having unnecessary regs is not useful. Having important regs to protect kids, people with conditions, people with addictions, people who are already on meds, who can't escape it, is a consideration. So that applies to residences right next to these mixed use sites that you're talking about, but it also applies to housing. And the lack of control over the ventilation is one of the major concerns that I have there. When you don't have enough code enforcement officers, and you won't, even with the new 8, code enforcement officers, there's such a backlog. This won't be, as you said, the police have much higher important things to do. And code enforcement officers have really serious health and safety considerations. I'm afraid this will drop down, but it'll also cause people to leave, very limited housing choices that they don't have other places to go to. And I also am concerned about playgrounds, a business next to a dispensary, like a delivery business where, the drivers can't be dosed when they're going out to deliver. All of those ventilation concerns are things that the business may not have control over because the landlord does.
Thank you, Lisa. Okay, Justin, you're up next. Please feel free to unmute.
Hi, yeah, so my question is also around cultivation, which I know you guys don't exactly have the clearest picture of what state standards are going to look like. But still, given current information, I'm interested kind of in the gray areas between cultivation for personal use. I know I was interested in how sort of strong restrictions on residential areas would have, how that would impact small scale, just personal cultivators, in-home cultivation. And also, kind of a correlated question as well, and sort of a dumb question, but I'm interested in how this will change penalties for illegal sales of marijuana, basically not unlicensed sales of marijuana. Does that shift then to basically being a regulatory violation and sort of almost like a business, like a sort of business statute, instead of being the current sort of criminal penalty that it exists as? And how does that work given the direction the state's moving in as well?
Thank you, Justin. There's no such thing as a dumb question. I think Linda has some stuff to say about that. Uh-oh, you're on mute, Linda.
I turned it off so as not to disturb people. As far as in-home cultivation for personal use, the statute allows for a good number of plants that you can have as an individual in your home for personal use. That's irrespective of our zoning. What we're zoning is businesses, commercial activities, that kind of thing. Under the law, and there's a very limited number now, and then once the dispensaries and the other businesses are open, it's a greater number of plants you can have. But within the statute, those personal use plants are not, we could not zone those out. Wherever you live, you are entitled to grow those in your apartment or your home. As far as the criminal statutes, there are still criminal statutes. The penalties have gotten significantly milder. I believe you got to get to 5 pounds of marijuana to get to a felony. So, you know, frankly, most stuff that's below a felony is not something the police are going to have the time or the inclination to even be dealing with. You know, the very, very small amounts are legal for possession, and then the amounts over that are, you know, very minor violations, and even then when you get a little more, it's a misdemeanor, but it gets up to, I believe, 5 pounds of marijuana before it's a felony.
Jen, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just that you can have 6 plants in your house, apartment, whatnot. And I believe 3 can be actively flowering and 3 should be, I'm not a botanist, in the dormant phase, but you can have up to 6 plants. And you can have up to 5 pounds of actual flower product in your house at one time. So
For
yeah.
personal use,
Correct.
which is an awful lot of marijuana.
Premature
for
and
personal use.
premature. Thank you, Logan, for the botanical, clinical terms. Yeah, so that's how much you can have in your house, and not obviously dealing that's for personal use.
Okay, so Logan, you have a question in the chat and you have your hand up. So I'm going to read the question in the chat first, if that's okay. And then you'll be able to ask your follow-up question. So, or maybe this is a comment. I would imagine the state would make the legal age 21. Oh, sorry, that's not a question. Logan, you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask your question or make your comment.
Yes. I was actually answering somebody else's question prior. I didn't know how active the chat was or whatnot, so I took it upon myself to
That's
guess.
great.
Anyway,
We appreciate it. Thank you for doing that.
Of course. Question. So actually a specific question about the zoning. So let's say, for example, I wanted to have a dispensary, sort of thing, a lounge, whatever, in within city limits. Let's say just on the East Henrietta Road, right? And where it comes to cultivation, though, and the quote unquote zoning, right? We have to make sure that not only is the dispensary or the venue in the proper location, but I don't want to cultivate in the same place. So how does the zoning work if I were to have a nice patch of land somewhere in, let's say, Pike, okay? What is that? How does the zoning work for that? And how does with obviously me going from my, if I had a bar, I have a warehouse in Scottsville, but my bar is on Avril, right? There's cohesion there. How does it work with the marijuana? And like I said, I'm cultivating in Pike, but my dispensary is in Henrietta, right? Is there some kind of legal fruit loop I gotta jump through, right? How do you go about it? Is that okay? Is that another thing?
So I think your question is kind of multi-layered. So just to review, we have the authority to do zoning and regulations around dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges. So that's what we were talking about tonight, right? So you have an idea of what we're looking at for that. For cultivation, right. We're not allowed to have local regulations around cultivation. However, it's our understanding that we at the very least have to be able to say what this business is categorized as in terms of land, like local land use, right? And so we would likely look at where are other types of similar uses allowed. Most definitely, well, I don't want to say most definitely, but generally industrial, right? But I think we have to take a closer look at the different commercial zones and the potential for that. So, you know, there, in that case, there might be some separation between where you would be allowed to have cultivation and where you'd be allowed to have a dispensary. The caveat on that, right, is that the state is issuing microbusiness license. Oh, I'm sorry, cooperative licenses. No, microbusiness license are the ones that include dispensaries, right? Microbusinesses.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you got a microbusiness license, you could have a dispensary and cultivation together. And actually, interestingly, one of the if the city decided to move forward with treating dispensaries like retail sales and services, there are limited circumstances that we allow retail sales and services in industrial. And one of those is when the retail sales and service is part of a larger industrial use and only takes up like 15% of the floor area, which kind of fits with our idea of a microbusiness, right? Like potentially that could be a good fit for a microbusiness.
Okay.
Does that kind of answer your question?
Can I snowball off of that?
Sure, yeah. Let's workshop it.
So that being said, having cultivation in microbusiness, essentially it would be like would be redundant, right? So in the micro business sector, how does zoning work with let's say I want to couple it with a garden, right? So let's cut out the middleman, let's cut out Pike, and I have a garden, I have a rooftop garden, so to speak, so on and so forth. I'm not just growing herb, but I am growing herb along with other things. Could I not double it as a like I said, like a garden, right? Because that's what's growing. It's all natural. It's all fruits and vegetables and herbs. And then downstairs is a dispensary.
So I think Linda
Part of that is going to
Yeah.
be an issue of what the state gives you in the way of licenses. You know, the state can say, even if it's properly zoned for that, the state gives you a license for a specific location, and they would have to make the call, even if it was zoned for that area. Were they going to give both of those licenses to the same person in the same location? So a lot of that's going to be under the state control, not us.
Okay. There's always a finer line, right? All right. I guess that sums up everything I wanted to ask. Thank you.
Yeah, but you can only apply for one type of license. And if you apply for the micro enterprise license that allows you to verticalize, that's okay, but you are limited to 25 employees, I believe. But you can only apply for one type of license cover.
Does that include it, or does that includes like a conditional and anything that's like blankets? It's a blanket, right?
Yeah.
Yes,
for all of them?
you can only have one kind of license. So if you want a micro enterprise license that allows you to verticalize, you're limited by the number of employees, things like that. Otherwise, that is not. If you anticipate having more than that number of employees, then that is not the license for you. They have not said how they will treat it if you end up having more than 25, but that's the intent.
And what
So
about
Logan,
revenue?
So if you're interested in doing both, right, then the answer is you should go for a micro business.
You can't do both. You can only do one license.
Right. If you want to be able to do both, you have to do micro business. The only question I have about that I think we don't know is, since the licenses are temporary, you could potentially apply and get a dispensary license or a cultivation license first. And when that license is up, you could then apply for a micro business license to try to expand and vertically integrate, right? Potentially.
Well, you still can't vertically integrate unless you have less than 25 employees.
Right.
So no one can vertically integrate unless you have the micro business license, because, and they're doing that to make sure that no one has a monopoly on all the supply chain. But so no, even if you get a conditional license and then you go to apply, you're still going to have one license to choose from.
Right.
And,
I just
and
mean, I don't want someone to wait. We don't know when micro business licenses applications are going to open. So if someone
Right.
wanted to get into the business now, maybe they start with one,
sure.
and then after
Yeah.
their 2 years license period, maybe, right? I don't know.
Yeah, if you can get into your cultivation license or your dispensary license on this first round, that's great. Yeah, do that. Because
Excellent.
you'll be probably in better standing with the state because you have a track record. So
Longevity. Thank you, lady.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Logan.
lady,
Okay. What?
Or man, I'm not sure. Or they.
Okay, the next question is from Lisa in the chat. What is it that is causing you to consider deeming an R center or a similar site as a sensitive use? Next to nursing homes, daycares, hospitals, methadone clinics like on South, Mount Hope, and Clinton. So that's a good question. Let me. So really the committee was looking at the potential for a few different other sensitive uses that other cities look at. And there is definitely a balance in not wanting to exclude too many properties in the process of including sensitive uses. Because interestingly, the state law says, hey, jurisdictions, you have the authority to impose regulations around time, place, and manner for dispensaries and on-site consumption lounges unless you make it impracticable. So there's this interesting kind of gray area that we have to understand where we don't want to exclude so many properties that the state says your regulation is actually regulating it out of existence or a possibility. Our center came up because the state looking at schools, it's like a related use and it's actually in conjunction with some schools. And we looked at its impact and its impact was moderate enough that it seems like it's a potential sensitive use to include. And any of my colleagues want to chime in, they can. I think I will say that methadone clinics is interesting. So we looked at the potential for drug rehab facilities. And a couple of things came up. One, what we heard from other cities is that if you do have your own sensitive use, you need to make sure that there is a distinct verifiable list of those facilities that you can rely on to use as a sensitive use list. Because if not, it can become really tricky determining what actually qualifies as a certain kind of use. And then there ends up being a lot of disputes between residents and potential applicants if we can't verify that that is a specific use. And in particular with drug treatment or supportive housing. In supportive housing we looked at, but supportive housing, actually some people that have mental health issues are prescribed cannabis as part of their treatment. And for drug treatment, there are some folks that actually use cannabis for addiction treatment. It's not a universal prescription or treatment, but it's out there. It hasn't been, there aren't studies to back it up because the federal law, it's illegal, so there can't be studies about it. But also typically triggers for people that are in addiction recovery are a lot broader than just smelling cannabis or seeing people use cannabis. In addition to, cannabis is legal in the state, so people can smoke pot anywhere. So if that's a concern for someone recovering from addiction, it's not just going to be happening at dispensaries or on-site consumption lounges. Does anyone else want to chime in on that stuff?
I would just say that if you're a heroin addict or, you know, opiate addict, smelling marijuana is not going to, you know, prompt you to do anything. You're already in that constant craving anyway. And methadone clinics are typically attached to some sort of hospital, clinic, something like that. So I don't think there's a ton of freestanding methadone clinics. So you would have to look at the zoning as, you know, if it's part of a larger medical center.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa. Are there any other questions? We've reached the end of the questions in the chat and no one has their hand up. Any last questions or comments? This has been a very good discussion. Please feel free to follow up with us. Oh, Justin, you have your hand up. Feel free to unmute. Oh.
Hi, yeah, this is related to something you guys mentioned earlier. You floated the idea of like a higher or like a certain level of like security standard for these businesses. And I was interested in if you're during your benchmarking process with other like cities that are trying to implement this, like what prompted the idea that these kinds of businesses would require like security staffing, and like whether there is actual evidence that these kinds of businesses are of heightened risk for really whatever would prompt that kind of regulation.
Yeah, so since cannabis is still illegal at the federal level, most businesses will not do business with cannabis businesses, which means most or a lot of cannabis businesses are cash only businesses. So not only do these businesses only have potentially a high amount of cash in store, but they also have products that could be sought after, right? And so it is common for other jurisdictions to require some things like a safe to put pot and cash in at the end of the night, an alarm system. Those are some common kind of general requirements. To your question about has it been seen as a verified security risk in other cities, I will say I think that's mixed. I think there are some cities where we have seen it be a security risk. There's stories of like a dispensary in Oakland being shot up with a machine gun. Stuff like that is pretty extreme in some cities. I don't feel confident or comfortable saying that that's the case everywhere. And certainly we're not sure what the impact will be locally, but at the very least, we want business owners to know that there needs to be some security for them. It's really a question of whether we require things locally. We also are pretty sure that the state is going to include security requirements in their regulations because it's so common to do that. And the state is taking a very comprehensive approach to the state law, unlike some other states where it's been legal for a while that put the impetus or the onus of regulation on the jurisdiction. The state is really taking a comprehensive approach. So it's difficult trying to think about what we want to require locally when we're actually still waiting to hear what the state is going to require. Okay, let's see. There's a question in the chat. When will the business focus sessions be held and where should I go to look for more information on the business end? So Jen just put in the chat after you, Scott, her email address. And that the Business Insight Center holds monthly programs on cannabis industry and really connects folks. Jen, maybe you can speak to what Business Insight Center does.
Sure. So we work with businesses of all types, all stages, all sizes, and cannabis is no exception. And we've partnered with Hemp Lab. We've started offering programs since December, monthly programs to assist people that are in the cannabis industry that want to learn from their peers and also learn from experts. So you can join our monthly meetup. You can also watch our YouTube channel, which will give you a ton of background information on, seed to sale, all aspects of the cannabis industry. And we also, like I've said, we have CPAs that specialize in cannabis when you're ready for filing your taxes, which will be massively problematic. And we also have attorneys that can assist us. And so any questions that you have, please reach out to us and we can definitely hook you up.
And then the other part of the question about the business development focused meetings, There will be one on July 13th, which is a cannabis business support open house, and one on August 10th, which will be a workforce development event. That information, when we have all the stuff to really announce it and put the dates and times, will be on the city's cannabis webpage, which I just reposted the link to in the chat. On that webpage, you can subscribe to email updates. So please do that, and because we'll also be nudging folks to remind you that those meetings are coming up. Okay, so thank you all. Oh,
I'm sorry. It's also the event on July 13th is also already on the City of Rochester's Rochester Public Library events calendar. So if you go to search events and go to July, you'll find it there, as well as the event on August 10th for workforce development.
okay, great. And Justin, I appreciate you're doing that thing where you kind of lay low and you're like, if no one else who hasn't asked a question,
Yeah,
That's
I'm
the
gonna ask a
strategy, yeah.
question.
do it,
That's
Justin.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. We appreciate that. Okay, so what's your question, Justin?
This one's pretty small. So I know the state set these like sensitive use distancing requirements. Do similar regulations exist for businesses that vend alcohol and tobacco? And like, how do those like distancing requirements compare to what the state has set for marijuana?
Do you want to take that, Linda?
I can't tell you off the top of my head if it's exactly the same. I don't know if Jennifer knows, but they are comparable. And yes, they do have the distancing requirements for sensitive uses, and they both for alcohol licenses and marijuana licenses, there will be a requirement for the municipality to be able to comment on the applicant before the license gets issued.
I don't know. I don't think that houses of worship are part of the alcohol sensitive uses, right? I think houses of worship is novel. They are?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's schools and houses of worship.
Okay.
Which goes back to our Puritan foundings, but I think it's going to be pretty comparable to that.
Justin, you just put in the chat tobacco as well. There aren't sensitive uses for tobacco sales. No. Side note, it is interesting to know that the state law prohibits sale of alcohol where where someone's selling marijuana, selling cannabis, but does not explicitly at this point prohibit sales of tobacco products. So potentially a dispensary and an on-site consumption lounge could sell tobacco products alongside cannabis, as the state law is now. The state regulations may change that, so we always have to put that caveat in there. But
yeah, I've been struggling with that for a very long time. People have started like smoking lounges in the city, and they want to know if they can have alcohol in their smoking lounge, and there's really no legislation or around it, so I never know what to tell them. But Justin, in terms of tobacco, there will be similar regulations because the state has just said you can't have like cartoon characters, and you can't have Camel Joe or whatever, and you can have neon colors. You can't have anything that's appealing to children. So that's a very similar regulation to tobacco.
okay. Thank you everyone for your time. Please feel free to subscribe to our email updates and visit websites, our website, the Business Insight Center website, the state's website, because that's going to keep you informed of state regulations as they come out. And feel free to follow up with any one of us with further questions. Thank you all so much. Have a good evening.